Tonight, we're learning new details in the death of legendary actor Gene Hackman.
1425 Old Sunset Trail, where Gene Hackman, 95, and his wife Betsy Arakawa, 65, and a dog were found deceased.
40 feet beneath Gene Hackman's private library, the beam of an FBI agent's flashlight suddenly struck something that stopped him in his tracks. An iron door, no handle, no hinges on the outside, only rivets, layers of rust, and a line of welding running across every seam like a scar. Someone had sealed this door from the inside decades earlier and never came back out. Whatever the FBI removed from the darkness beyond that door was never meant to see the light of day. And what it revealed about one of the most private men in Hollywood will force you to see the final 30 years of his life in an entirely different way. The Break-In, February 26, 2025. Just after 11 in the morning, a small convoy of federal vehicles approached a massive system of reinforced steel gates hidden deep among the pinyon pine forests outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. Beyond those gates stood an estate valued at $4 million. It was the private residence of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, classical pianist Betsy Arakawa. For several days, no one had seen or heard from the couple. Phone calls went unanswered. Staff members were denied entry. An absolute silence had settled over a property that normally operated with the discipline of a small military installation. The person who finally raised the alarm was not a relative, a friend, or a member of law enforcement. It was a maintenance worker. He told sheriff's deputies that he believed the couple was dead inside. The gate had to be forced open. The locks had to be cut. That detail alone told investigators that something was wrong. This was not the kind of property someone could accidentally leave unsecured. Everything on the estate had been designed to remain sealed unless someone inside deliberately opened it. When officers finally crossed the threshold, they expected to encounter a sorrowful but ordinary tragedy. Two elderly people had quietly died in isolation, but that was not what they found. The bodies of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were discovered inside the mansion, along with the body of one of their dogs. Investigators later confirmed that Betsy had died approximately 1 week before Gene. Her cause of death was recorded as a severe viral infection. Gene was believed to have died from heart failure and related factors. Natural causes. Case closed, at least on paper, because the scene did not match what had been written in the report. Not at all. The contradiction no one wanted to explain. This is where the entire story begins to fracture. From the very first day, the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office told the public that there were no signs of criminal activity. It was the kind of standard language often used to bury a story before it had the chance to grow. Yet, within that same statement, officials admitted that the scene was suspicious enough to require a full forensic examination of the property. Pause for a moment and consider that again. There were supposedly no signs of a crime, yet the property was suspicious enough to require federal teams, thermal imaging equipment, and forensic specialists. Those two statements cannot exist within the same reality, and that contradiction tore the entire narrative apart. The timeline also raised questions that no one appeared willing to answer publicly. Betsy died exactly 7 days before Gene. That meant Gene Hackman, a 95-year-old man, had remained inside the house with the body of his wife for nearly a week. He did not call for help. He made no attempt to contact the outside world. There was not a single message from a man who, according to those who knew him, had still been capable of holding a completely normal conversation only weeks earlier. What could have kept a man silent for 7 days inside a house containing the body of the person he loved? Fear? Duty? Or grief so deep that it had taken away his voice? Perhaps he knew that calling for help would bring strangers into the house, and that they would discover what lay beneath it. Before going any further, one point must be made clear. If even half of what investigators reportedly documented beneath this estate can be verified, this would become one of the most disturbing discoveries ever connected to the death of a celebrity in modern American history. Sources claim to have gained access to the official search warrant. What authorities documented inside the property extended far beyond the boundaries of a routine death investigation. Hidden behind a wall in Hackman's private library, federal agents discovered something that no employee, neighbor, or local law enforcement officer had ever known existed: a tunnel. It had remained sealed for decades. Whatever had been confined inside it, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that it would remain buried forever. But the tunnel was not the worst part. The worst part was what had been waiting at the bottom. The fortress on the hill. To understand what the FBI entered beneath the ground, you must first understand what stood above it. Gene Hackman's estate was not a house by any ordinary definition. It was a facility. Dense forests surrounded the property on every side. Tall stone walls extended around the entire perimeter. Motion sensors guarded every approach. Thermal cameras watched the grounds. A surveillance network operated 24 hours a day, with a level of sophistication reportedly comparable to the security surrounding certain classified government sites. Every employee was personally selected, subjected to extensive background checks, and bound by legal agreements so strict that not one person had ever spoken publicly about what happened inside those walls. Consider what that means. Decades of gardeners, housekeepers, private chefs, maintenance workers, and security personnel. Yet, there was not a single leak, not even an anonymous account. In the age of social media, when even a cleaning employee might post a photograph of a celebrity's trash for attention, that kind of silence does not occur naturally. It is enforced. Local journalists who attempted to investigate the history of the property all encountered the same barrier. Requests for construction permits were returned, with entire sections completely blacked out. Property records contained gaps that no archive employee could explain. One researcher from the Santa Fe Historical Society reportedly spent months collecting land records connected to the estate. Then, without warning, she suddenly stopped. She no longer answered phone calls. She published nothing. No one knew what she had discovered or who had quietly instructed her to end the investigation. Yet beyond those gates, the interior of the estate was astonishing. Original works of art lined the corridors. The furniture was centuries old, with some pieces reportedly having once belonged to European royal families. The chandeliers were rumored to have hung in the great halls of ancient palaces. The gardens contained plant species so rare that fewer than a dozen documented populations remained anywhere in the world. Dr. Elena Vasquez, an architectural historian at the University of New Mexico, who later advised the property assessment, offered a haunting observation. "I have studied estates throughout the American Southwest, but this place was designed like a museum inside a military base. The beauty was real, but so were the defenses. That combination could only exist if someone was protecting something very specific." Footage from police body cameras, released only after a rare public ruling by a New Mexico judge, showed deputies moving through the mansion during the first hours after the bodies were discovered. The silence in the recording was immediate, heavy, and suffocating. But it was not the stillness that disturbed investigators most. It was the evidence that someone had been active inside the house during the hours or days before police arrived. Furniture had been dragged across the hardwood floors. Books had been removed from shelves and returned in the wrong order. Drawers had been left partially open. A safe in the bedroom stood wide open and completely empty. Someone had searched the house. Either they were looking for something, or they were trying to hide it. Then the agents entered the library, and everything about the case changed. The descent. Behind a particular section of wall in Hackman's private library, concealed so precisely that someone could have stood in the room 1,000 times without ever noticing it, agents discovered a hidden mechanism. It was not a hinge bookcase. It was not a release concealed behind a painting. It was an engineered entrance that could only be opened through a specific sequence of actions. Whoever created it wanted the passage to remain completely invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look or what to do. Behind the mechanism was a narrow corridor, followed by stone steps descending into absolute darkness. There was no source of light and no detectable ventilation system. There was only a carved throat of stone plunging straight into the earth beneath the estate. The agents began their descent. The temperature fell with every step. The air became thick and damp, carrying a metallic taste and the faint smell of rust mixed with something far older. Condensation covered the walls. As flashlight beams swept across the stone surfaces, the first real sense of unease began to take hold. The walls were covered in carvings. They were not graffiti. They were not decorative patterns. They were precise symbols, cut with tools and created with unmistakable purpose. Some resembled alchemical markings. Others looked like technical diagrams of machines and mechanisms that, according to conventional history, could not have existed when the tunnel was built. One section of wall appeared to contain the blueprint of a machine with no known modern equivalent. Gears, sealed chambers, and channels were arranged in configurations that a forensic technician would later describe in his notes as engineering from nowhere. Even the structure of the tunnel told its own story. Near the entrance beneath the library, the stonework appeared clean and characteristic of construction from the middle of the 20th century. Industrial materials, reinforced poured concrete, and straight edges cut by machinery. But the farther the agents descended, the more primitive the walls became. Joints had been carved by hand. The support systems were crude. Tool marks matched picks and chisels rather than any form of powered machinery. Marcus Devlin, a structural engineer who independently examined leaked photographs from inside the tunnel, estimated that the deepest sections could have been more than a century old, and possibly much older. This structure was not built by the owner of the house, Devlin said in an interview that was later removed following legal demands. The upper section was renovated, modernized, and reinforced, but the core of the tunnel was already there. Hackman simply moved into the house above it. He inherited it. Then they reached the chamber. It was a vast underground space that seemed frozen in time. Ancient wooden crates were stacked along the walls. Some had collapsed with age, spilling their contents across the stone floor. Yellowed documents lay among rusted metal objects and artifacts that did not correspond to any clearly identifiable period or place of origin. One agent lifted the lid of a dust-covered box and found photographs inside. They were extremely fragile, with curled edges and fading surfaces. The images showed unfamiliar faces dressed in clothing from a century earlier. Some appeared to document secret meetings held in windowless rooms. Others showed locations, buildings, and underground spaces that did not correspond to any site named in official records. In one photograph, a group of men stood around a table covered with maps. Their faces were tense. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting sharp shadows across each man's features. On the back of the photograph, someone had carefully written a date in ink. Beside it was a single word written in a language that has still not been identified. Leather-bound files rested beside the photographs. Inside were coded dates, blacked-out names, and passages describing events that appeared to have been deliberately erased from history. Some pages had been partially burned. Someone had tried to destroy them, but either stopped voluntarily or was interrupted. Other documents carried watermarks and insignia linked to organizations that had officially ceased to exist decades earlier. The volume of material was overwhelming. Agents estimated that fully cataloging everything stored in the chamber could take years, perhaps an entire decade, even with teams of preservation specialists working in rotating shifts. Some sheets were so fragile that they began to disintegrate the moment a gloved hand touched them. Others had been sealed inside oil-treated leather pouches and looked as though they had been written only a week earlier. The difference in preservation suggested that the last person to enter the chamber knew exactly which documents could be sacrificed and which ones could not. Among the recovered items were 3 separate ledgers written in a mixture of Latin, French, and an unidentified script that linguists have reportedly refused to describe publicly. There were maps of the American Southwest showing borders and settlement patterns that matched no recorded historical period. There were sealed glass containers wrapped in straw and filled with unidentified material. According to a leaked evidence log, there were also 2 objects described only by the words, "Unidentified device, do not open." But this was the part no one had been prepared to confront. The photographs, documents, and wooden crates were disturbing. What waited at the far end of the chamber, beyond all of them, belonged to an entirely different category. The door that could not be opened. Deep within the far wall of the chamber, behind the wooden crates and scattered files, the agent's flashlights finally found it. An iron door had been set directly into the stone. There was no handle on the outside. No hinges were visible. There was only a corroded steel surface and lines of welding running across every seam. Someone had welded the door shut from the inside, and they had taken extraordinary care to ensure that it would remain sealed. The lock had not been designed to prevent someone outside from entering. It had been designed to keep something inside. The FBI has never publicly revealed what was behind that door. There has been no official comment, no leaked information, and no anonymous conversation with the press. In an era when classified documents can appear on a Discord server and internal surveillance footage can spread across social media within hours of an incident, that degree of information control does not happen by accident. It requires an active and sustained containment effort, and that tells us something important about what the FBI may have taken into custody. But the story became stranger still. The floor of the chamber was not simply stone covered in dust. Complex circular patterns had been set into its surface with obvious intention. Viewed from above, they resembled celestial maps. Star charts had been carved into the floor by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They were not random, and they were not decorative. The patterns corresponded to specific astronomical positions, including constellations, planetary locations, and paths of movement. Everything had been arranged with a degree of accuracy that required advanced mathematical knowledge and careful measuring instruments. Whoever created them had not been guessing. They were mapping something, or marking something for a person who would arrive later and understand how to read it. The tools recovered from the wooden crates were equally difficult to explain. Their engraved markings matched no known manufacturer or historical period. Their internal mechanisms were so precise that they appeared to require manufacturing technology unavailable at the time the tunnel was supposedly constructed. One device attracted particular attention from specialists. It was a metal cylinder no larger than the palm of his hand, containing a series of rotating inner rings. The entire device appeared to have been cast as a single piece, with no visible seam or evidence of assembly. Even modern metallurgical techniques would struggle to recreate that kind of seamless casting at such a small scale. Dr. James Whitfield, a former FBI forensic analyst who spent 19 years handling classified evidence before retiring, reviewed the details that had entered the public record. His conclusion was impossible to forget. When an agency becomes silent this quickly, there are usually only two possibilities. Either they found nothing and are embarrassed, or they found something so important that the decision to release information moved beyond the authority of the investigative team. I have seen both situations, but this does not look like embarrassment. So, who was Gene Hackman really? Was he a man who collected impossible artifacts? Was he the guardian of a body of knowledge that someone had decided must never emerge? Or had he simply inherited this underground world from someone else, along with a burden that eventually became his responsibility? The answer may still lie within the land itself, and it may explain why he and Betsy never left the house alive. The world beneath Santa Fe. The ground beneath northern New Mexico is nothing like what most people imagine when they think of Santa Fe's art galleries and desert sunsets. Los Alamos, where the first atomic bomb was created, is only a short drive away. The Manhattan Project, nuclear testing, and weapons research funded through classified budgets all took place within easy reach of Hackman's front gate. For decades, local residents have shared stories about underground transportation systems, forgotten bunkers carved deep into the rocky plateaus, and infrastructure designed to protect government leaders in the event of civilization's collapse. Requests submitted under the Freedom of Information Act have quietly confirmed that extensive underground construction did take place across the region during the height of the Cold War. The exact scale remains classified. Richard Payne, a former Department of Energy advisor who participated in facility assessments across northern New Mexico during the 1990s, offered a chilling description in a recorded interview. There are systems beneath those plateaus that were built to outlast everything on the surface. Some were decommissioned, some were sealed, and some were simply forgotten. Removed from every official map and every classified record, they quietly disappeared into the darkness. But one detail cannot be dismissed. The iron door at the end of Hackman's tunnel was not decorative. It was made from military-grade steel. The spacing of its rivets matched construction techniques used in highly secure government facilities built during the 1950s. If it had been nothing more than a wine cellar or a storage room, no one would have constructed it like a bank vault. But if it was a forgotten branch of a much larger government network, spreading silently beneath the entire region, then the scale of the story changes completely. The warning signs. Margaret Calloway, who owned the property beside the estate for 22 years, still remembers the sounds. Low-frequency vibrations would begin at around 2 or 3 in the morning. It was not the plumbing. It was not the heating system, she said. One day, while trimming a hedge near the property line, she casually mentioned the vibrations to Hackman. He looked at her with an expression that, according to Calloway, she still thinks about every night. Then he said only this: "Some things are best left beneath the surface." At the time, she laughed and dismissed the remark. She is not laughing now. Another neighbor initially assumed the vibrations were caused by minor seismic activity. He was a scientist, and he wanted a scientific explanation. One summer, I placed a portable seismometer near the property simply to prove to myself that I was imagining it, Delkamp told a reporter. But the readings did not match any natural pattern. They had rhythm. They were mechanical. Something beneath the ground was operating according to a schedule. He filed a formal noise complaint with county authorities in 2019. No investigation was conducted. Other residents remembered unmarked trucks arriving after dark and leaving before sunrise. They spoke of mysterious visitors whose faces were concealed. No invoices, no company logos, no trace. Some former employees left the estate and then disappeared completely from public life. Their phones were disconnected. Their social media accounts were deleted. It was as though their existence had been quietly erased. A housekeeper who worked at the property during the early 2000s reportedly told a close friend that she had seen things inside the house that she was never supposed to see. She refused to explain what they were. Less than a month later, she left the region entirely. Her forwarding address led only to a postal box in a town where she had never lived. Years later, when a documentary researcher contacted her sister, the family revealed that they had received only one postcard from her, sent in 2004. After that, nothing. There was also the matter of the estate's water consumption. A request for public utility records submitted by a local watchdog blog in 2021 revealed that the mansion consistently used far more water than could reasonably be explained by the number of people living there. It was enough water to support a small commercial facility operating underground, or, in other words, enough to maintain systems that no one on the surface had ever seen. The ghost line. One detail has received almost no public attention, even though it should have stopped everyone in their tracks. During the initial renovation that reportedly exposed the tunnel entrance, workers discovered a second communication system wired directly into the walls of the estate. It was not a telephone line. It was not an internet cable. It was a closed network connecting the main house directly to the underground chamber. The wiring was old. It had been installed decades before modern communication technology became common, yet it remained functional, carefully maintained, and fully operational until the day the FBI entered the property. Someone had preserved this line for years, communicating with whatever was inside the tunnel through a channel that no outsider could monitor, record, or intercept. The house already possessed an advanced digital surveillance system, yet this network existed completely outside it. A ghost line ran through the walls like a hidden nervous system that no one was supposed to see. Who was waiting at the other end? What could have been important enough to require a communication channel invisible to the rest of the world? The silence. The official account states that Gene Hackman died from heart failure at the age of 95. On paper, that explanation appears entirely reasonable. But paperwork cannot explain why a couple with access to some of the finest private medical care in the world became completely isolated during the final days of their lives. No doctor was called, no emergency contact was reached, no member of staff remained on the property. The exterior alarm system was still active, but the interior cameras had been manually disabled. Two people were alone inside a fortress, dying in silence while a sealed underground chamber waited 40 feet beneath them. The possible connection between the tunnel and their deaths remains the most difficult part of the entire case to explain. Were they silenced because they knew too much? Did someone use the tunnel to enter the mansion without being detected? Or had something changed? Had an event finally convinced Hackman that whatever he had protected throughout his life was no longer secure? And then there is the detail that reportedly haunted every investigator who touched the case. The tunnel entrance inside the library was not sealed when the agents found it. The opening mechanism had been activated recently. Gene Hackman, a man in his 90s, had descended into that cold and damp corridor not long before his death. Why? What had he gone down there to inspect? What was he afraid of? Or was the real question the one no one dared to speak aloud? Was he running from something that he knew had finally found him? The warm man behind the fortress. This is what people often forget about Gene Hackman. Before he became a recluse, before the fortress and the silence, he had been one of the warmest and most familiar figures in American cinema. His barber in Santa Fe told a local reporter that Hackman would arrive every few weeks, sit in the same chair, and talk about Hemingway novels and the weather in Kansas, where he had once grown up. He always left twice the expected tip. He remembered the names of every employee's children. Vendors at the local farmers market recognized him. He often bought large quantities of green chilies and joked about his terrible Spanish. He donated to local literacy programs. He quietly wrote checks to support a nearby animal rescue center. He was not a man who chose isolation because he hated people. He chose it because something made him believe that isolation was necessary. Now that we know what was reportedly hidden beneath his home, that decision carries a weight it never possessed before. From the French Connection to Enemy of the State, Hackman spent his career portraying men trapped inside conspiracies they could not escape. He played federal agents, reporters, investigators, and whistleblowers. In Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, he portrayed a surveillance expert consumed by paranoia. These were men trapped inside institutions far larger and far older than they initially understood. Perhaps it had never been only acting. Perhaps Hackman understood something that the rest of us could only observe from the outside. What happens next? FBI forensic teams are reportedly still working beneath the estate, analyzing every artifact, every document, and every symbol carved into the walls. They are searching for trace DNA, using techniques designed to reveal invisible residue, and attempting to decode messages written on sheets of paper so fragile that they could turn to dust when touched. Specialists from fields that rarely intersect have reportedly been brought into the investigation. Linguists, metallurgists, even astronomers were said to have been quietly consulted to interpret the star maps carved into the chamber floor. If those clues eventually lead to specific names, organizations, and historical events, this case will not merely generate headlines. It will explode. Yet authorities have said almost nothing. Their statements remain vague, carefully calculated, and clearly designed to reveal no meaningful information. That silence says more than any press conference could. Consider what it means. Months have passed since the original discovery. In any ordinary investigation, some information would have escaped. Preliminary findings, anonymous sources, or private conversations between officials and reporters would have begun to appear. But in this case, there has been nothing. Zero. The information blackout surrounding the tunnel appears even stricter than the secrecy surrounding the deaths themselves. That suggests whatever was found underground was not merely historically significant. It remained operationally sensitive. Someone, somewhere, decided that the contents of the chamber were still dangerous enough in the present day to justify complete containment. Not in 1950, not during the Cold War. Today. The doors that were never meant to open. Beneath the estates of powerful people, beneath forests, mountains, and quiet towns that we believe we understand, there may be doors that were never meant to open. Gene Hackman reportedly protected one of those doors for decades. He built his entire life around it. The walls, the cameras, the silence, the legal agreements, the vanished employees, and the complete isolation. He carried that burden from the height of his career to the final days of his life. He carried it through Academy Award ceremonies and film promotions. He carried it into retirement when he abandoned acting and turned instead to painting and writing quiet novels. He carried it into the final cold week of his life, when he sat alone inside the fortress with the body of his wife and chose not to pick up the telephone. Now he is gone. The last person who may have known every corridor of the tunnel, every wooden crate in the chamber, and every carving on its walls has disappeared. Whatever lies beyond the welded iron barrier, 40 feet beneath his library, is no longer his responsibility to protect. The question is not whether the FBI knows what is down there. They know. The question is what could be so dangerous, so destabilizing, and so threatening to the foundations of our understanding that authorities would prefer complete silence over telling the public what they discovered behind that door. What do you believe is waiting there? Was Hackman the final guardian of something buried long before he was born? Or was he its final prisoner, serving a sentence he inherited the moment he first turned the key? Leave your theory in the comments below, because I read every one of them. And to be here when the next piece of this story emerges, subscribe before you leave. Somewhere behind an iron door in the New Mexico desert, something is still waiting. It has waited through wars, through generations of presidents, and through the rise and fall of empires that once believed they would endure forever. It waited beneath the boots of the men who built the atomic bomb only a few miles away. It waited beneath the wheels of every unmarked truck that entered that road after midnight. For nearly 30 years, it waited beneath the home of one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema. And it appears that silence was never the same thing as safety. I will see you in the next video.